weekly podcast where we try to take the issues of today and put them in a larger historical and theoretical context. And one issue that we talked about before on here is tariffs and trade balances. And this is obviously something that President Trump, is obsessed with. The whole tariff kerfuffle, tariff insanity is still ongoing. It's unclear what tariffs exist on what at the present moment. That's always seems to be changing day to day, but he seems very insistent that tariffs are good and that they're important, that they're going to help America. In his words, we've been getting ripped off and by other countries, we've been giving away billions and billions of dollars, and we're going to stop that with tariffs. And this has attracted a lot of criticism, right? And there's a very, very standard answer you'll hear to this from, and I mean, I hate to say the word, but from neoliberal economists, from, the standard stalwart defenders of the world trade order as it exists. And they'll say, well, obviously, number one, free trade is a good thing. Comparative advantage says some countries are better at making one thing and some countries are better at making another thing. And then, you focus on what you're good at and you trade across borders, and more free trade creates more benefits for everybody in terms of efficiency and production. And when you ask them about trade deficits, they'll say, well, those are good too, right? Because what does American trade deficit mean in practice? Well, it means that we take little pieces of paper and we ship them overseas. And in return, we get stuff. We get flat screen televisions and cars and clothing and all the things you actually want in life. And that seems like a pretty good deal, right? It's just free stuff. So you shouldn't object to trade deficits either, and everything's fine, and has been fine for decades. I'm a little bit skeptical of that line. And so I wanted to have on the podcast someone who has written about this, and is both critical of Trump's tariffs while also saying that there may actually be some problems in the world trade system as it has existed. There may actually be some things we need to change. Steve Waldman, I am very excited to welcome you onto the podcast.
I am very delighted to be here. I'm a longtime reader of your work, and I'm excited to talk to you.
Yeah, so Steve is an economics blogger where he writes about economics, finance, politics over at Interfluidity. And he's had a lot to say in recent days about trade deficits. So I thought I'd just start by asking you a pretty flat-footed question. Are trade deficits good or bad?
So I think, like most economic questions, the answer is it depends. But what I would say is that trade deficits are sometimes good when they are undertaken for particular purposes for finite periods of time. So the sort of standard economic story is, suppose you're a developing country and you want to upgrade yourself. You've been making textiles by hand, but you want to build factories and become a more modern economy. You're going to need capital equipment. You're going to borrow it. You're going to borrow the money or get vendor financing to build the factories, the modern factories. You can't do that yourself. You're going to borrow money in order to trade for those capital goods. That's a trade deficit. You're buying these goods, factories and stuff. You're taking on debt. That's running a trade deficit. But that's a good trade deficit in a very straightforward way, because you're going to use the product of that trade deficit, those goods you're buying, to produce exportable, tradable goods, right? So when you run a trade deficit, almost by definition, you are decreasing your financial net worth, right? That doesn't mean you're decreasing your overall net worth, because you're buying assets, you're buying things, and that has value too. But you're decreasing your financial net worth, and that is important. But if you're decreasing your financial net worth in order to build something that you're going to then sell to the rest of the world, that's just like, a business making an investment in something that's going to, you build your widget factory and then you're going to sell lots of widgets in the future. Sure, for a while, you're spending money out of pocket and your financial net worth goes down, but in the foreseeable future, you're going to recover that and then some, right? So that's sort of a standard story for why trade deficits are important. And that's fine. The trouble with the United States' trade deficit and with the trade arrangements in the world for really since the late 1990s, since the Asian financial crisis, is rather than deficits and surpluses, the other side of a trade deficit is somebody has to be sending you stuff and getting your financial assets in exchange, right? If you're running a trade deficit, your financial net worth is going down. Somebody else's financial net worth is going up, but they're giving you some kind of stuff. Um, since the late 1990s, rather than trade deficits and surpluses being kind of occasional things when a country wants to invest in new technology. On the other side of that, we have countries like Norway that want to save because they sell a lot of oil now, but they want to extend what it's worth for many years into the future. Those are like sort of good, normal stories of trade deficits and trade surpluses that are going to be transient. They have a particular reason, they exist for a particular period of time, and then over time, those circumstances end. But since the Asian financial crisis, we've lived in a world where many countries just want to accumulate dollars. Um, and the United States runs, in order to accommodate that, or the causal story can be complicated, but accommodating that, the United States runs a persistent, indefinite trade deficit, right? So it is continually losing financial net worth to get stuff and give dollars or dollar valued assets to the rest of the world. And that, I think, is really a bad thing. So it's that persistent, indefinite trade deficit, as opposed to, there are other benign trade deficits, um, that is bad. And the reason why it's bad, I give sort of four distinct problems with persistent trade deficits. So one is the one that Trump likes to talk about. They're taking our money, right? So one part of a financial trade deficit is you're losing financial net worth, right? Again, losing financial net worth doesn't mean you're losing real net worth. If I am giving you $10 and you're giving me $50 worth of coffee for that $10, I might be better off in real terms, but it is a fact, even in that trade, that financial net worth, at least in an immediate sense, you're losing. And if you are getting something, if I'm getting $50 of coffee and I can just resell it for $50, then that's very transient. But that's not really the situation. We're trading for goods and services that we consume or that we use that aren't going to be resold. So one is the loss of financial net worth. Um, that's important, but it's a little bit complicated to talk about why it's important. As you said, when you sort of described the neoliberal view, one way of thinking of financial net worth is, hey, we just make dollars. They're just spreadsheet entries. So what? So what if that spreadsheet entry gets bigger? But I think that's lots too casual, right? We make financial systems out of promises. And yes, promises are tallied in spreadsheets, but promises are important. It's important that we keep them. It would be a terrible cost if we run into a kind of crisis where we have to sort of devalue Argentina style in order not to default on our promises. So that's the reason that Trump always emphasizes. The second reason is also commonly discussed, is that a persistent, indefinite trade deficit distorts domestic production. So since other people are really eager to send us their tradable goods and services, we then come to specialize in non-tradable goods and services in the United States. So in a certain sense, that's great. It's specialization in trade. We specialize in things that we do nice things for one another, and the rest of the world specializes in giving us stuff. But a lot of the reason why we became kind of an important and reserve currency in the first place is because we're a big enough and mature enough economy that we're supposed to be relatively diversified and not fragile. And over time, if we really withdraw from tradable goods and services very substantially, tradable goods and services are really important to the economy. We can't get by without them. So the irony is that you become a reserve currency by being a mature, diversified economy that people think that through thick and thin, the goods and services you produce are going to have value. So promises redeemable for those goods and services, your currency is going to have value. But a persistent trade deficit that results from that makes your economy fragile. So you're in a situation where all of a sudden you need PPE and you can't find it, right? So we as a country, and also for the long-term value of our promises, it's not great for us to basically say our comparative advantage is everything non-tradable. That's too narrow and fragile a comparative advantage. We need to be good at producing tradable goods and services too, and a persistent indefinite trade deficit saps that over time. And then the final set of issues with a trade deficit have to do with political issues and democracy. The opposite side of a trade deficit is a capital surplus, which is a way of saying that other people are investing in your production or in your securities. A world with a lot of trade deficits and trade surpluses is a world where there's a lot of cross-border ownership of things. And that creates challenges from the perspective of countries like to be able to control their own regulatory environments, think of themselves as democracies. But if you have a lot of cross-border investment, there's a danger that a democracy will involve basically expropriating foreigners' assets in your country. So with cross-border investment, we saw this initially in NAFTA and in every major trade agreement since. A world full of cross-border investment is a world where trade arrangements increasingly constrain what democratic publics are allowed to do in terms of regulation that affects economics. Um, and that leads us again sort of to the Trump era, where people are just sort of angry that they feel like something about modern economics has taken their own communities out of their democratic control.
Yeah, and I think we saw a lot of that anger from the left, actually, when it came to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and especially the investor-state dispute settlement courts that
Absolutely.
were going to be a part of that. And there was like outrage that like you're telling this other country that like they don't control their own legal system, that part of their legal system, and especially the part concerning foreign investors, is going to get hived off and is going to be under this international institution that like functionally the large countries control. Right. So I think
Yeah.
this gets to a larger point that I like to make here is that Trump in some ways isn't coming out of nowhere. Right. That
Yeah.
his response has been chaotic and I think ultimately deeply wrong-headed, but there's something that happened in the world economy that people are very unsatisfied with. Um, and so, one of the stories that you often hear about this isn't so much what you talked about in terms of financial net worth or the stability of an economy, but more the hard calculus of national power, right? And that seems to be the anxiety that's animating a lot of people in the Trump administration, right? Where they see that there's a connection between a trade deficit or a trade surplus and industrial power. And industrial power in the modern world is one of the most important bases of military power, of national power, right? That, you can't fight a war without an enormous industrial base standing behind you, as we've seen in Ukraine and in Russia. And I'm curious what you think of that line of thinking here.
So I think that's actually a valid line of thinking. I would rather, just because I don't love thinking in terms of war, I want to concede we have to think in terms a little bit of war in the world. We do need defense. We do need to be, um, I think at least pre-Trump, Pax Americana was broadly a good thing in the world, despite some pretty horrible errors. We do need a world that has some kind of a defense architecture, and we would like countries with values similar to ours to be well enfranchised in that global defense architecture. So that's important. I would just broaden the argument to say, in my initial spiel, I talked about like distortion away from tradable goods and services. Um, Besides that, tradable goods and services are important, as you say, manufacturing in particular has a lot of what economists call externalities. So one of those externalities is if you're good at manufacturing and you have supply chains that can get the inputs that you need for manufacturing, you're probably pretty good at military stuff. And that's important. But there are lots more externalities of manufacturing. Um, Innovating at building new things, at designing new things. Um, the more you do in terms of manufacturing, the more likely you are to put together ecosystems of people who are capable of collaborating to do really new things in the physical world. So it doesn't seem to me a coincidence that all of a sudden China has accelerated to solar panels and batteries and EVs kind of very easily. And we're having a really hard time even advancing in the manufacturing sectors we were historically good at, like, commercial aviation and Boeing. Um, we used to tell this story triumphantly in the 80s. I remember hearing sometime early in my economics education about a time when pre-Ayatollah Iran contracted with the US to have their own helicopter factory. They wanted their own helicopter factory in Iran. And so, the Americans, we arranged it for them, we built it, but it was an island, right? Everything that it needed had to come from the United States, right? There's this manufacturing, most economic activities. Silicon Valley is not really manufacturing at this point, but we understand it's got these agglomeration effects. But manufacturing is just a huge physical endeavor involving lots of physical and chemical and sometimes even biological sciences, lots of disciplines, and the physical places where people are gathered, and the skills and capabilities, and then also the physical tools, the physical capital. Manufacturing capital is kind of surprisingly less bespoke than you think. If you have car factories, you can turn them into truck and plane factories with surprising ease. Whereas if you just have data centers and you're trying to get plane factories out of them, it's not going to work. So yeah, broadly, just to circle back to your point, like, not just for military reasons, letting ourselves specialize out of tradables meant specializing out of a lot of things that were important for national defense, for geopolitical power, and a lot of things that were important just for generalized technological capability. There's just a generalized important capacities that come from manufacturing prowess, and letting that all go overseas has really harmed us a lot, I think.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of agreement that there is some kind of, like you say, externality, a broad public benefit. It's not hard to measure exactly, and it's very hard for any single firm to like capture it. But on a national level or even a regional level, it seems clear that you like to have these kinds of communities of manufacturing expertise, that they are productive, they are innovative, they create new technologies that create more economic growth. And I mean, this is why, you were talking about at the beginning, say, well, you're an undeveloped country and you want to like make the leap out of being an undeveloped country. So you want to have an industry. And this is part of the reason why you would want to like deliberately pursue a national policy that creates an industry of one kind or another in your country in order to generate these positive externalities that will propel your economy forward. Um, so I think there's a lot of agreement about that, but people have not necessarily connected that with the question of trade surpluses and trade deficits and the whole international trading system. Or at least they haven't for a while. That connection is becoming more clear now. Um, and so I guess that's what I want to focus on, is this question of why countries pursue trade surpluses and how they pursue trade surpluses. Like, what kinds of policies do countries pursue in order to maintain a trade surplus, right? Not one for any, short-term specific purpose, the kind of beneficial things that you're talking about, but like a long-term, decades-long sustained trade surplus. What's going on there?
Yeah, so there's the how and the why, and the why of it's sort of the flip side of some of the problems we've been talking about. Countries that want geopolitical power are going to want a big manufacturing base. There's also the financial side. People like to have money, and if you're running a trade surplus, yeah, you're surrendering goods and services, but you're getting financial claims. And just like if you're a store, you like it when people come in and buy your stuff. You're losing stuff, but you're getting money. Um, so in a world where, for the most part, promises have been good, right? The U.S. for a long time has run the dollar system, and people haven't been too badly burned by accumulating dollar assets. Um, people like to sell stuff. So it's understandable, I think, why countries enjoy being in surplus until there's a crisis. It feels like prosperity, right? So if we look at China, if we look at Germany, at least until recently, before the Ukraine war, they have buzzing factories, they have lots of employment, people are making money, firms are making money, money's coming in from overseas, so there's less need for the government to run a deficit in order for people to continue to have incomes. Basically, there's a financial subsidy, might not be the right word, but a financial bonus or revenue coming in from outside of the country. So it's enjoyable to run a surplus um, for countries. How they do it, one way or another, is they subsidize tradable goods, and um, maybe tax is maybe too strong a word, but discourage with policy means domestic consumption. Right? So China famously or infamously pays very little interest to its savers, has state-owned banks, and lots of state-affiliated financial funds that lend to firms in strategic industries at below the risk-adjusted, what we would consider the risk-adjusted cost of capital. Those banks do absorb lots of losses, right? So on the one hand, there's no, it doesn't, this form of subsidy does not look like, hey, the government's giving you money, to subsidize your manufacturing. It just looks sort of like capitalist activity. Firms are going to banks and they're borrowing, but they're borrowing under terms that a purely profit motivated, risk averse banker would not lend under. The net effect of that is lots of those loans go bad, but lots of activity in the sector occurs. Um, and so the combination of subsidizing the activity and discouraging domestic consumption, also keeping wages down. This is, Germany's trick in the early 21st century with the Hartz reforms, right? Trying to suppress wages, trying to suppress interest paid to households, trying to subsidize tradables, production. The net effect is a really good deal for foreigners. So foreigners find that, hey, these overseas firms can make goods more cheaply than our firms can because wages are suppressed and they're getting capital more cheaply. So we can buy their goods for cheaply. The entrepreneurs of those firms, the exporters in China and in Germany, do very well under this arrangement. They can still sell at a profit. They have the subsidy, they have those suppressed wages, they sell at a profit and still undercut our domestic producers. So basically, the government and households in the strategic surplus country subsidize the profits of their exporters and the consumption of foreign consumers. So we, as we're accustomed to talking about how during the 2010s, we as consumers got this like tremendous subsidy from VCs. Like Ubers were cheap for a while, and we could get our burrito taxis for nothing. But we've been doing that for like 30 years, where the subsidy has been the households of China and the workers of Germany have been subsidizing our consumption. And we've gotten a lot of enjoyment from that, and we've gotten a lot of great goods and services from that. But the cost has been this slower strategic loss of manufacturing and tradables capacity generally.
Yeah, so this is a really interesting point. One that I was struck by reading Michael Pettis's books, The Great Rebalancing and Trade Wars Are Class Wars, where he talks about, okay, the international trading system has certain kinds of norms about fair and unfair trade practices, right? That there are rules about dumping. You can't say, okay, we're going to produce this steel at such and such a cost, but then we're just going to sell it on the international market at a much lower cost. That's an unfair trade practice. You can't do that. I mean, there's a little bit of a question about why you think that's an unfair trade practice, if and bad, if you also think that the trade deficits are fine, but let's skip past that. And Pettis's point is that there are certain kinds of very visible unfair trade practices. But these days, if you want to subsidize your industry, you pursue these other kinds of methods that are much more obscure in a lot of ways. They're obscure in their operation to the ordinary consumer, and obscure in their operation to international regulators. So, like the China example that you give is you say, okay, Chinese savers, we're paying you all this money, but you're going to put it in a bank account because that's where everybody puts their money, but the interest paid on that is going to be terrible. And because the state regulates the total, like the interest rate that any bank can offer. And you might say, well, can I just take my money and invest it abroad? And the Chinese state says, no, absolutely not. You cannot take your money out of the country. You don't really have a lot of options, so you put it in the bank. And that is an enormous transfer to the banks. The banks are, very much under the thumb of the state. And the state says, you are going to be lending at, again, these highly subsidized interest rates to the kinds of industries that we prefer, right? We want to have an EV industry. We're going to say, yeah, we're going to be giving out an enormous amount of loans at very favorable rates to new EV companies. That stimulates a lot of industry, a lot of production. But what do you do with all the stuff you produce, right? You can't sell it to your own people because the whole point of the system is that you're suppressing their ability to consume. The whole point is that you're taking away their ability to purchase all the stuff that you're producing. So what do? Well, you ship it overseas and you sell it at these, you know, obscurely or indirectly subsidized prices to consumers in other countries. And the consumers in other countries like that a lot because they get a lot of stuff. Um, but the industry in those other countries, maybe they don't do so well, right? Because they can't sell to their own people quite as effectively because they're, facing a subsidized competitor. And also they can't sell to Chinese consumers who, again, their wages have been suppressed. So they can't afford to purchase at the prices that, it would cost to produce in a foreign country. Right. So you wind up with more industry in one place and less industry in another. And like you say, that can feel good, right? Because it feels like national power. And people like that. Even ordinary people like feeling like they're from a great and powerful nation. And oftentimes it involves, like you said, high employment, right? You might not have a lot of stuff to buy. Your wages might not be as high as you'd like them to be, but you do have a job and you do earn. And again, people like being employed. Shocker, I know. Um, but there's also an argument that this is not a functional arrangement over the long term. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that and what kind of dysfunctions we should expect from that kind of system.
So two things, Keynes's thing in the long term, we're all dead. So what I have to say about China in particular is that Western economists have been making this kind of point for decades. I've been following the debate for decades. It's basically you're just screwing your own consumers, right? You're not maximizing welfare in your own country. You're doing this stupid thing where you're giving away goods effectively for cheaper than it costs to produce them. And that can't go on forever. And in the meantime, you have people who aren't living as well as they could. And I've watched this debate, and at the same time, in welfare terms, the single largest economic miracle in the history of humankind is the past 4 decades in China.
Yeah.
So I think what we are learning is those externalities that we started talking about a while back are worth a whole lot, right? So it is absolutely true in the micro story that basically every step along this path has involved stealing from the Chinese worker and consumer and then sharing the loot with people who are politically well placed in China, with exporters in China, and with Western consumers who are much richer than the Chinese. Like that is 100% true. And yet the externalities of that theft of welfare have been so profound that I think there are very few Chinese people, if you could, get them away from all state censorship and all fear of anybody being mean to them and ask them, would you have pursued this policy from 1980 to 1920 to 2025? And even explain to them exactly how they're effectively being stolen from. I think 80% would say this has been good, right? This is this was the right thing to do, right? So it's a real lesson, I think, for economic thinking, because in economic thinking, it's often convenient to privilege the flows that you can see that are very clear, those sort of internal flows that, look, we're suppressing wages. And it's, you can always tell a story about externalities. It's a vague, woolly kind of story. I think if we, we're doing more, you know, car making, we'd be better placed to deal with climate change in the future because we'd be better at building stuff or whatever. Like, they're woolly stories. You can't, but as frustrating as it is for a certain kind of scientific person to admit, like, those woolly stories are real. And even though we can't sometimes distinguish the good ones from the bad ones, the ones that happen to be true are really going to um, affect the flow of how things go. So we have no choice but to use our judgment, and we're never going to have a great, like, empirical study. We're never going to be able to say to everybody's satisfaction, this story is right and this story is wrong, but we're going to have to be able to use our judgment and say, like, okay, well, even though we can see clear costs of this, um, and the benefits are this kind of woolly story, we're going to have to go with this woolly story. So that's the first thing I'd say. Then to the question of, okay, so this has happened for a long time. What are its limits, right? There obviously things are going to happen that are going to, it can't go on forever. This sort of stealing from the public and sharing the loot with Western consumers and stuff. And I think what we're doing is we're seeing those limits come to appear now. Interestingly, the dissatisfaction has never come from inside of, say, China or Germany, right? The people who are allegedly the victims from a kind of Western perspective of this. We're always telling them, rebalance, give your consumers more stuff, let them live better lives. They're never the people who are mad about this, because that sense of general prosperity is profound, right? I mean, we see the opposite in the United States now, where, if you kind of look at living standards by the numbers, we're living as well or better than we ever have by some people's numbers. There are things to quibble with, I would quibble. But just in broad terms, we're not living badly in the United States, but we feel things slipping away. And honestly, like, our sense collectively of well-being is more about the direction than about the fact that we can get, sushi today and it's flown in from wherever. Like, that's awesome, but we feel that what we might write off as sort of geopolitical or national power, like, we feel it in our welfare and in our lives. So the dissatisfaction doesn't come from China or from Germany. It comes from the trading partners who, even though we're the beneficiaries, we're getting this loot stolen from Chinese households, right? We're getting the free burrito taxis, but instead of burrito taxis, they're like cheap TVs and stuff, right? Or amazing EVs. Even though we're getting this stuff, we're realizing this is just not good for us. We're being sort of subsidized and coddled in ways that are preventing us from having capacities that we want, from having the pride that we want. So the limitation that's coming is that the rest of the world is, now going to refuse to absorb this stuff. And it's taken a long time because, as you say, the ways China has subsidized things have been subtle, so haven't hit, sort of anti-dumping laws, or very plain, they haven't tariffed their goods a lot. And so that there's this obvious unfair trade practice. The Trump administration has to impute non-tariff barriers to everything wherever they see a trade deficit, because people have been subtle. But just because something is subtle doesn't mean it's not real. And we understand, American economists, Western economists understand the mechanisms by which China subsidizes things. Western economists, just for a long time, never thought it would be a problem because they thought it was ultimately counterproductive for the subsidizer. In the same way that for a long time, Western economists refused to acknowledge that things like predatory pricing could be a problem in domestic economies. The theory was always, well, they can predatory price for a while and maybe they'll drive someone out of business, but they can't do it forever. And as soon as they stop, capital will pour in to eat away their monopoly, right? And that just sort of ignores the benefits you get for being a monopoly for a long time. And that's the same thing has happened with trade surplus countries internationally over a long time. Western economists have understood the forms of subsidy that they use to develop and maintain their trade surpluses. But economists, for the most part, have basically been like, if they want to subsidize us, let them subsidize us. Eventually, they'll stop, and then when they stop, we'll rush in, and our manufacturing sector will be back like that. But it turns out that it doesn't work that way. Like, human capabilities take decades, um, and so it's a loss. And so what we finally, both in sort of domestic antitrust context and in a global context, we collectively, it's unfortunate that it's taken the form of the Trump administration, which is much better at identifying problems, but is abysmal at thinking about reasonable solutions. But we've collectively come to realize, both domestically and internationally, that production capability is hard, has to develop over time, and that tolerating monopoly and tolerating indefinite surplus, these are not great things. We need to develop our capacity. So now we're in a moment when Western countries are going to increasingly put up resistance to especially China's attempt to use the rest of the world to be the buyer of last resort of the goods and services it's producing, that it doesn't want to give its own public the capacity to purchase. And that does create a crisis for the surplus countries, because now they have, what economists refer to as overcapacity. It's only overcapacity while they suppress the consumption power of their own publics. But then, so we end up in this world that we're in now, where we have sort of two obverse problems, where the surplus countries have overcapacity, given that the deficit countries are refusing to stay deficit countries, or putting up barriers. And then the deficit countries have an even deeper problem, which is we don't have the capacity to produce for ourselves at the same quality and price, even putting aside the surpluses, right? They get very good at what they're doing. They could end, the subsidies. Putting aside the subsidies, even if they end the subsidies, they're much better at this stuff than we are now, right? China is not the manufacturing powerhouse of the world because their workers are cheap or something like that. They are the best in the world in most manufacturing spheres now, and it will take us some time to
So I,
develop.
wa- I want to I want to kind of put on my little devil's advocate hat
Sure.
here, or I guess it's the China advocate hat, and something that you'll hear um, from defenders of Chinese industrial policy. They'll say, "Look, you're always accusing us of these unfair practices and consumption suppression and blah blah blah," but no, we're just better, right? We are better at doing industry. We're better at producing, and that's why we have a trade surplus. And you're just complaining because, like, culturally or institutionally, you're not doing very well at producing things, and therefore you're running a trade deficit. And I'm curious what you think about that argument.
I think it's fine. This is what I'd say, is that we're never going to agree. It's a fool's errand, right? The sort of Trump tariff that imagines it has a mathematical microscope into distinguishing what's unfair trade practices versus fair is never going to exist. We all behave differently. We all have different capabilities and capacities, and it's great that the Chinese are really proud of their capabilities, right? This is why, though, I say we should, in the international system, use balance as a lodestar, right? So maybe it's just true that they're, better at all these things than Western countries are. The United States, in particular, is now. Well, then we should only buy from them to the extent that we sell to them, and then it becomes self-regulating, right? We are always trying to distinguish between unfair trade practices and fair trade practices, and the assumption underneath that is everybody wants to run the biggest surplus that they can, right? But if we take surpluses off the table, if we just say, hey, countries, except for a few narrow exceptions that are time bound, when a developing country is tooling up its factories, a Norway-like situation, if we just say, as a norm, in general, countries are in balance, we don't have to worry. A country can do whatever it wants. It can be as unfair as it wants to be in its trade practices, right? But if it arranges its economy so that it's just going to try to sell a lot of stuff, but its consumers are going to be unwilling to buy a lot of stuff, the net effect of that under balance is it's just not going to be very integrated in the world economy, right? Because if it's only allowed to sell as much as it buys, then if it suppresses its consumption, it's also suppressing its sale. So the reason for balance as a norm isn't because balance is always right. Like there are times when a country should be in deficit or surplus, but the reason why we want it as the overall norm in the global system is it takes us out of the business of trying to micromanage what countries do, worry what's a fair trade practice, what's an unfair trade practice. All of that is about this game of chasing surpluses because countries like to be in surplus. And if we just say that's just a bad game, right? Chasing surpluses, mercantilism isn't a game anyone should be able to play. We're trying to trade. Trade is supposed to be mutually beneficial. We're going to give you goods and services. You're going to give us goods and services. We do that in balance, then you can do it however you want. If you want to do things that suppress your consumers' ability to buy, it's a Westphalian world. You're free to choose to adopt those policies in your country if you want, but you're not going to sell very much either. You can choose to be disintegrated from or integrated within the global economy, but you can't choose to be a seller to, but not a buyer from.
Yeah, so there's a lot in what you said that I think is really interesting, and I want to talk about. But first, I want to start with a historical comparison that you've made with the United States after World War II, right? That after World War II, like most of the factories of the world have been exploded by high explosives. There's a couple of exceptions, and far and away the biggest one is America, right? We are the industrial powerhouse of the Western world. We're not very well integrated with the communist bloc, so they have their own factories, but it kind of doesn't matter. Um, and as you show, like we aren't really running a large trade surplus in this period, right? We are at an like producing an enormous amount of stuff. We are shipping it to all over the world. But also, what do we do with the profits of all that stuff that we're selling to the world? Well, we turn around and we buy other stuff that other people are selling. Um, and I think that's an important lesson to keep in mind, right? That you can be very good at producing something, right? To the point that you dominate the world industry in that and you're selling it to everybody. But the point of selling stuff to other countries, theoretically, right, should be to buy stuff for your country, right? To get something back at the end of it.
Yeah.
So I find that kind of undercuts some of the logic of people who want to defend China by saying, well, we're just better at producing stuff, and that's why we run a trade surplus. Being better at production shouldn't lead to a trade surplus, especially not one that is sustained, that is very large, decade after decade. So I just wanted to kind of note that. And I want to come back to this norm of balance that you've been talking about. And there's an argument I've seen made by Michael Pettis, one of the other people who writes about these questions, where he kind of makes the comparison between nations and individual firms. Where he said, well, in an economy, you might have a firm, and that firm, what it wants to do is suppress its own wages as much as it can, produce as much as it can, as efficiently as it can, to make more from less. And that will give them a competitive advantage in their industry. And he says, yeah, but if every firm is actually successful at doing this, at like zeroing out the wage component of their production, that's actually going to be a disaster for the economy, right? Because where does the stuff go? Like, where does the profit of the firm come from? It comes from selling it to people who have the money to buy it. And he says, and this is really one of the engines of economic growth and development is a high wage economy where your workers are making enough money to have enough demand to want stuff to make it profitable to produce more things, right? And I think Paul Allen, I can't remember, it's Paul Allen, I'm getting that name wrong. He has this book, I think it's a brief economic history. Sorry, I'm totally blanking on this name, I'm sorry. I'll find that, put it in the show notes. But he has this argument, right, that a high wage economy is also a high growth economy because it creates all these incentives for more production and more technological innovation and more efficiency. And Pettis's point is that when you see every nation racing for a trade surplus, you can see how this is kind of actually dysfunctional if everybody does it, right? If everybody is suppressing the demand and the consumption in their own economy and pushing that into industry, those industries are all going to start to be unproductive because there's no one to sell to, because we are all, again, in this kind of mercantilistic race to the bottom for industrial production. And I'm curious what you think about that line of argument.
Yeah, I think it's true. And so we have fallen into um, a way of doing things that would have been very recognizable to 1930s, 40s Keynesian, right? So Keynesian started talking about injections and leakages of financial flows of purchasing power into an economy. And so if you have an economy where wages are very suppressed and all the firms are earning a lot of profit, and the people who reap profit tend to be wealthy people who kind of bank rather than spending their purchasing power, that's a big leakage. And so you need an injection, right? So to the Keynesians, a traditional injection is a government deficit. Well, the world that we have evolved in this sort of post-Asian financial crisis, China surplus world is one where, because China sort of sets the frontier, sets the competitive benchmark that everybody's trying to compete against, and it does so with, wages and sort of ordinary household incomes that are pretty suppressed. And so companies around the world are busy trying to compete with China, and that means we break our unions and things like that. We don't have a hot wage economy anymore. And so we end up in this sort of Keynesian paradox of thrift world, where we're capable of producing all kinds of things, but the workers who build those things don't get enough income to buy it. And so we require external injections. And so the world now depends on two kinds of external injections, both centered in the United States, right? One is the US explicit government deficit, right? So, like, as if we were one country in an old school Keynesian world, when we fall into a paradox of thrift, the government can get us out of it by being unthrifty, by going into debt, by printing money effectively and spreading it around to people. And then we developed this new thing that Keynes would actually have been familiar with, but I think very disdainful of, and didn't emphasize. Whereas government expenditure was a helpful thing, I don't think he would think of this as helpful. I think he would think of it as pathological. But we've also come to rely on financial asset appreciation, right? So we've arranged things in the U.S. dominated financial system so that a lot of financial and also real estate assets consistently rise in value. And the combination of those two things, of government deficits and financial asset appreciation, offsets the loss or the missing wages of this sort of China set competitive world. And everything balances, right? So broadly speaking, the world does now consume everything the world produces, but the distributional questions surrounding this are pretty abysmal, and we end up with people like Trump, right? So we end up in a world where the people who are actually working to produce the things can't, at least not as a result of working to produce the things, can't afford to purchase the things. But people who are near the fount of government spending can afford to purchase things, and people who already have financial assets, so people who are already wealthy, get a whole lot more income from this financial asset appreciation. And so they buy a lot of luxury goods, and we get a sort of luxury tilted economy. So nobody likes, this is not a good set of distributional arrangements, even though it does balance out as a way of, okay, well, everybody produces and everybody, we produce a lot and we consume a lot. But distributionally, we don't like it. And then politically, there's a problem as well, because the Keynesian world where the government deficit is going to offset a lacuna in consumption presumes also that the government can kind of rebalance the economy, so that if all the profits are going to the rich people in the country and the government spending at a deficit, the government can start to tax the profits of those wealthy people so they don't just sort of get insanely wealthy. So there's not some insane imbalance in the economy. But when we're doing this internationally, it's not so easy for, say, the U.S. government to be like, okay, well, we're running terrible deficits, and I mean, terrible. I don't even want to say terrible. We're running big deficits, right? Maybe that's fine, but we're running big deficits, and that means a lot of purchasing power is flowing. That's the injection. It's leaking to certain places. Pools of purchasing power are accumulating in a few pockets and places, and we're going to use sort of taxes and redistribution to reorganize that, so we still have a broadly, a society in which everybody feels enfranchised. But when the places that are sort of accumulating those profits are often overseas, when it's not one domestic economy, that becomes more challenging. So it's really, we we have adapted to this world where basically wage workers starve and we rely on other sources of purchasing power. But it's not a world we like or should like. And that doesn't necessarily mean that wages are going to come back to be the main source through, but it does mean we have to think about these institutions. We just sort of fell into a kind of, cryptocurrency like asset appreciation stimulus approach,
Yeah.
and it's not good. And we actually have to think out, like, okay, if we do want government deficits to engender purchasing power, then the distribution of how we spend that is important. And it is going to be a concern if we, oddly, as conservative economist Greg Mankiw, who made this case, I think in the 90s, the spenders, savers, he was trying to argue against deficits. And he was pointing out that the result of a deficit is going to be the people who save most are going to get sort of indefinitely accumulating deep pockets. And we shouldn't want that. And that's why we should curtail deficits. So maybe we could maybe he's right and we should curtail deficits, or maybe the deficits are fine and we should tax the F out of those deep pockets of those savers. Whatever it is, we actually have to think it out. And we actually have to take the distributional question seriously and the power question seriously in an international context.
Yeah, so there's so much there that I really agree with. The extent to which our economy does seem to be running on asset appreciation rather than wage growth. There's a great book about this called "The Asset Economy." I think it's very all of this, including the international capital flows, is deeply tied up with the housing problem we have in this country, and we could probably talk for a long time about all those. But what I want to ask you is, what can we do about it? How can we start to solve some of the problems that you've been talking about in the international trading system?
So I'm so glad you asked, because I have in my
Yeah.
pocket a favorite solution. So, I keep bringing up Keynes. Keynes was the prophet of all of this, I think.
Yes,
I
very
mean,
much so.
he really foresaw this set of problems, and he tried at Bretton Woods to craft a solution that would prevent the emergence of global imbalances. Um, and the Bretton Woods system, from that period post-war, when the U.S. had all the factories and nobody else did, quickly fell into balance under Bretton Woods. Within 5 years of the end of the war, the U.S. was balanced overall. And it worked until basically the Nixon shocks in the early 70s. And the US actually stayed in balance through the early 80s, right? It was a pretty good system. Trade was free. We had comparative advantage. We traded a lot, but we just kind of maintained balance. And I think that's what we want. So one proposal that's often put forward is Keynes's original proposal, which was Bancor and the International Clearing Union. And the idea is that we would settle international trade with a kind of quasi currency that a global central bank would issue. And the cool thing about the story is that deficit countries always pay interest because they're borrowing money, but surplus countries are never penalized, or not naturally penalized for running surpluses. They get the interest, they enjoy it. And under the Bancor proposal, the International Clearing Union would penalize, would tax the surplus countries on their surplus. It would, since it would be the clearing, it would know exactly sort of what the net balance was of each country, and surplus countries would be taxed. So that was Keynes's original proposal, and I think the basic form of it is right, but I don't think it's plausible today. Right? He was writing at that moment when the Western Allies had been triumphant and we were crafting a global international order. And we could imagine a supranational institution like a global central bank that everybody would deal with. I think in the world as it is now, fractious, the IMF is no longer beloved in the world. Nobody trusts that there's going to be sort of a neutral technocratic central bank maintaining balance for everybody. So my proposal is this: it's something that deficit countries can do unilaterally. It does require a norm, right? I, even though a country can do something unilaterally doesn't mean it's going to have good effects if the rest of the world thinks it's a villainous thing to do, right? And it's going to lead to all kinds of but what I propose is that we should, one, establish balance as a norm, right? We should think, generally speaking, countries should be near balance. Doesn't mean instantaneous balance. This month they might sell more and next month buy more, but over time, countries should be in balance. And it's legitimate for deficit countries to pursue balance, right? So it's the right thing to do. If you're a deficit country, you're a persistent deficit country, you don't like it, you are allowed to pursue balance. But how should you pursue balance? The problem with what Trump is doing, tariffs are a terrible tool to pursue balance because they don't tax imbalance, they tax all trade, right? Trade is wonderful. It's how we get prosperous, right? But unbalanced trade is something else, right? So what we want to do is tax the imbalance. And fortunately, we have a whole universe of things whose purpose is to track and regulate flows, and that's the whole domain called finance, right? We forget about this sometimes. Finance isn't intended to be like Bitcoin. It's just not intended to be a number that goes up, like you buy a thing and the number goes up and now you're like, that's not what finance's whole job is, to regulate how we produce, consume, and trade, right? It's a regulatory domain that we've partially privatized. And the thing about unbalanced trade is like a slug. It leaves a trail, right? Balanced trade leaves no trail. Unbalanced trade leaves all these debt securities as you got goods today and you gave up financial assets as what you paid for it with. And you might have a stock of financial assets, you just pay money, but ultimately it becomes the debt securities of the country that's the deficit country is issuing debt. And so my suggestion is that we just tax the holders of foreign debt. That every country, not just the United States, again, I think it would be bad, it's sort of Trumpian in a pejorative sense, to be like, unilaterally, the US is going to do this crazy thing. No, we want a world in which countries understand that we're all equals in the world. We want to persuade the world that we got ourselves into a pickle. Keynes was right. Letting imbalances go crazy is just a bad idea. We should not do that. We want a world where, broadly speaking, countries are generally in balance. The natural agents to do that, since we don't have any trustworthy supernatural thing, the natural agents to do that are the deficit countries, because they're the ones who don't like the imbalance. Even though they're getting free goods and services, deficit countries typically dislike it. They experience the problems associated with running a deficit. So we simply say, hey, it's going to be normal. Every country in the world, when it issues financial securities, when its firms and governments issue financial securities, we're going to have the financial sector track, domestic or foreign. Nothing more fine-grained than that, in my view, invites mischief to be like tracking whether it's German or Chinese or whatever, right? Just domestic or foreign. Every financial security holding is going to be noted by financial institutions that manage that holding, domestic or foreign. And countries have the right to impose a differential tax on foreign holders on the payouts of those securities, right? So if you're earning, 5% interest, quarterly, so, 1.20% interest per quarter. Every quarter you get a coupon payout from your bond. If we put a payout tax of 20%, right, instead of that 1.2%, you're going to get a little under 1%. So we're going to just impose a tax. And so the effect of that, it's indirect. And it doesn't rely on trying to categorize goods and services. We don't have to worry about rules of origin, how much of the car comes from where, all of this stuff, right? We invent financial sectors to track things because it's lots more straightforward to track things abstractly than to try to get into the nitty-gritty details of physical things. We don't have to care about any of it. We just look at debt securities. We look at all of the securities, debt, equity, whatever it is. Is it held by a foreign person or a domestic person? If it's held by a foreign person, we have an adjustable tax. As we raise the tax, it's going to be less and less appealing for the foreign provider to sell to us for our debt securities, right? We're basically impairing the value of the debt securities in their hands. So every time, say, a Chinese supplier sells us something, they get dollars back and they have to make a decision. They can do two things effectively with those dollars. They can redeem them for American goods and services, send them back to us, or they can hold them. Now, they can send them to Europe or something like that, but that doesn't matter to us. It's the US, rest of world. It's home country, west for every country, not just the US. Again, it's not a US. From every country's perspective, it's home country, rest of world. Rest of world can either purchase home country goods and services and extinguish the debt, or they can hold the debt. And by taxing the payouts to that debt, we can make it less appealing to hold the debt and encourage them to redeem those financial securities they get for home country goods and services. And it's an adjustable thing. So, if we can start with a very gentle tax to basically say and signal, hey, we have a tool, we're not going to tolerate a trade deficit for too long. It'd be good for us to start balancing trade. And then over time, we can ratchet it up to make it very unattractive to hold, U.S. securities if we're finding that the trade deficit is not susceptible. It can be ratcheted up pretty arbitrarily, but you wouldn't want to. You'd want to do it. This is again a Keynes point when he encouraged a little bit more national self-sufficiency. He's like, when you want to disembarrass yourself of your foreign entanglements. I love that word, disembarrass. I wish I could communicate like Keynes. You do it gradually, like teasing a plant into a new way of growing. You don't uproot things, right? This is again a Trump issue. So we can start with a tax. It can be a gentle tax. At first, it's just a signal of what we're doing, but we can, credibly make it clear we're going to ratchet it up over time till we get a lot closer to balance. We can not say this is an American privilege. Every deficit country can do this. And the end result is deficit countries would have unilaterally in their own hands a tool that they can use to adjust their tolerance for trade deficit. Maybe they are that developing country and they want new factories and they want a trade deficit. They set the tax to zero. That's fine. But every deficit country that experiences its deficit as a problem has a tool they can unilaterally use to bring themselves towards balance. But it doesn't affect balanced trade at all, right? Because balanced trade doesn't leave those financial securities. So it's completely consistent with a kind of Ricardian free trade view. It is only a tax on trade imbalance. So that's my suggestion.
Yeah, I think there's a lot in there that's really interesting and good, honestly. I was going to kind of ask you about Bancor and press you a little bit on that. But I take your point that it doesn't feel like politically we're in a situation where we're able to pursue those kinds of international institutions in the way that we were able to pursue them after World War II. So I can see the argument for just, have both promulgating it as a norm, but not actually institutionalizing it, and then just doing it as a unilateral national policy. I think there's definitely that kind of argument I can understand. And there's a lot to be sympathetic to in this particular vision. And like we can contrast it with tariffs, right? That tariffs have all kinds of problems. Like number one, with a bullet you've talked about, is they tax trade. All trade, good, bad, balanced, imbalanced, they are a tax on trade. Other countries hate them, and you can get involved in trade wars. And so there's that thing that they're just like inherently kind of anti-prosperity. And then on the other hand, they're very hard to administer, right? Especially in an age of highly integrated supply chains where, the final production facility might be here, but it's taking parts from here, which were first produced here, which were made from raw materials over here, where there's these enormous integrated global supply chains. And so we find, Trump officials trying to say, well, we're going to tax bicycles from Canada on 50% of the steel content of the alloy that goes into the bicycle. And it's like, how on earth are you supposed to administer that kind of regime? And like you say, there's a line that I kind of like, is that like money is how we measure physical goods. And it's a really nice abstract system of measurement. And that means that we don't actually have to have people, at the ports of entry trying to measure the carbon content of a bicycle frame, right? We can just say, well, we have this whole financial system and we can track the money moving through it relatively well. And yeah, I mean, like you said, maybe there are going to be some problems with compliance. People will try to disguise ownership, but we have tools for trying to track financial flows, and they are much easier to track than material flows that are happening in a factory in some other country, right? And so enables like a very clean kind of a tax that will very directly lead to more balanced trade without taxing trade per se, right? That can promote these kinds of good outcomes that we're looking for. And one of the other things that I kind of like about this system is the scope that it gives to democratic control over the economy. Um, in particular, that this is not a system where countries are going to be banned by international law from pursuing industrial policy. Right? If you want to pursue an industrial policy, you can do it. If you want to say this is a sector that we want to promote and we want to subsidize as a nation because we think it's important, right? We think it is a matter of national security or national pride or just good policy. You can totally do that. Um, you just have to, in some sense, like bear those costs internally, right? It's like, okay, yeah, and where's the subsidy coming from? It's going to be coming from our people, right? It's a matter of a tax or a transfer or a regulatory change. um, so there's both this level of democratic control over the economy, but also accountability to the public for the kinds of policies that you're making. So I think that's a very attractive aspect of this proposal as well.
Yeah, no, I agree very much on that. I feel like we're like economists often think of it as a separate domain, but the reason why we're having a hard time running a global economy right now is that the way we ran a global economy for the last 30, 40 years left people around the world feeling out of control. Like we promised democracy and capitalism, but capitalism kind of ate democracy a little bit. It constrained what people felt they could do. And we didn't like the outcome, and we didn't feel enfranchised, and so now publics are throwing over the table and
Yes.
electing weird dragons.
No, I think that's right. And this gets to something that you've written about. We're a little bit over time, but I do kind of want to talk about it, if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely.
Um, which is the political trilemma of the world economy. Am I getting that right?
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, can you tell us a little bit about what the political trilemma is?
So this is a famous economists love trilemmas, right? Trilemmas are where you get to pick two out of three, like fast, good, or cheap. Pick two, this kind of thing. And Donny Roderick, who's a really remarkable economist for decades, I like him very much because he's neither a contrarian, mad at the neoliberals for being so horrible, nor has he ever been a neoliberal. He's been able to sort of chart his own kind of very reasoned, I think, path through. And for decades, he's been a little bit of a dissident. He was not with the neoliberal consensus, but he was also not just sort of part of the kind of knee-jerk opposition that comes from different political groups. He's a really interesting character. And in the year 2000, he wrote about this trilemma, where he said that there was the trilemma between, he described it in terms of nation states, international integration, and mass politics. Um, but mass politics I don't love. I'm going to say nation states, economic integration, and meaningful democracy, right? Because that's really what he meant. And he pointed out that um, you could have only two out of three. Although, as is usually the case with trilemmas, instead of thinking of them as you get to pick two wholly out of three, I like to think of them. Remember, Photoshop used to have those color triangles where, like, you could be like, there's
Hmm.
black, white, and fully saturated. Like, but you can be at lots of points in the triangle. Um, but as you gravitate towards a line, towards two, you're sacrificing some of the third. And so he pointed out you could have, for example, meaningful democracy and economic integration if you basically had government at the world level, right? So if we took the U.S. sort of federalized model and ramped it up to a global level, we could have a global democracy, lots of economic integration, um, and lots of democracy, but we wouldn't have nation states anymore, right? But if we want to keep our nation states and we want to keep meaningful democracy, then that's going to put limits on economic integration, he says, right? If we chose what we chose from, say, 1980 to 2010, and we want to have nation states, but we also want to have like economic integration, if we want to get sort of back to the Trans-Pacific Partnership kind of world, from NAFTA to Trans-Pacific Partnership, well, we have nation states and we have economic integration, but we find ourselves in a world where publics feel like they can't regulate the economy, where basically it's Margaret Thatcher's there is no alternative world, where anything that you want to do that would, say, support the wages of workers is going to mean that you're uncompetitive, right? So basically anything that the public wants to do, meaningful democracy, there's going to be a technocrat busy telling them, hey, if you do this thing, you're just going to, crater our economy. And they won't be wrong, right? It's not that the technocrats will be liars. It's that if you integrate the world economically as nation states, then a pace setter like China that basically sort of sets the productivity adjusted wages of their workers, you don't have the choice of paying your workers more than that. You're just not going to be competitive. There's not meaningful democracy. So Roderick said, you can pick two out of these three. He gave them names. That one with economic integration in nation states, he called golden handcuffs. The one where you don't have nation states, you have democracy and you have economic integration, he called like global federalism. And then the last one where you have nation states and democracy, he called the Bretton Woods Compromise, right? So you have nation states, you have democracy, but you didn't have as much economic integration in the Bretton Woods Compromise. But I think he sort of, in sort of framing his trilemma as symmetrical, understated how good that third line was, that Bretton Woods Compromise, because it's not really true. What it invites you to think about, the pick two out of three, is that, like, okay, we could go back to autarky, basically. Like, we can have nation states and democracy if they're autarkies. But the Bretton Woods Compromise was not autarky at all. It was a free trade regime, right? We got rid of tariffs over those Bretton Woods decades very quickly. It was just a free and balanced trade regime. So what I like to say is that Roderick sort of undersold the possibility space a little bit, because you can pick 2.5 out of 3, right? You can have nation states, meaningful democracy, economic integration, but not full financial integration, right? So if you run imbalanced trade, then you're going to have that cross-border ownership, lots of debt securities or equity securities that you're paying for things with. And this again brings us back to something Keynes said in the early 30s, right? In the early 30s, he wrote an influential, really just a brilliant piece of writing. If you've never read Keynes's short essay, it was really a talk. So it reads like fluently. It takes no time. It's called National Self-Sufficiency. I don't think there's a more brilliant piece of economic writing in all of history, in just a few pages, and it's very lively. But in that speech, he said basically he thought at that time it was between World War I and World War II. And as a European, he was shell-shocked by World War I and emphasizing pacifism. He was thinking about economics and the cause of peace. And he, in that essay, said that he thought culture and travel and lots of things were inherently international, but economic production, he was leaning towards being primarily natural, but he said especially finance and ownership, right? And I think Keynes, 13 years later, 11 years later, whatever, Keynes at the Bretton Woods Conference had adjusted. He was no longer so interested in self-sufficiency in terms of production. He was back with Ricardo on comparative advantage, but he retained, hey, look, let's trade goods and services. Let's let that be international too. But let's not have so much cross-border ownership. Let's keep that level of economic border relatively strong. And I think where he landed was a really good place. it worked really well for decades. We, I think, simply erred by giving up on a world where we have free trade, but domestic ownership and investment. And then we can get a whole lot of economic integration. We can keep our nation states. We can keep our sovereignty. We can keep our democracy. We have we 2.5 out of 3, right, of those
Yeah.
desired outcomes.
No, and I think that's this idea that we've made a mistake is something that I dwell on. Because you mentioned like Margaret Thatcher and this slogan, "There is no alternative," which is very associated with like the golden handcuffs of the neoliberal era, where it's like we're going to have free trade and everybody's going to be rich. We're just very sorry you can't regulate your own economy. And there's nothing else. There's nothing else that can possibly work. And I think we are very much in a position where there clearly are alternatives, where something has cracked open in this space of possibilities, and we are back to these big questions about how do we want to set up the world. And I mean, one of the, and we made a mistake, like you said. One of the things I'm always very struck by reading economic history is the sense that there are some things that are structural and big time structural forces that led in this or that direction. And then there are choices that people made based on their economic theories and their economic understanding of how the world worked. And there are some very notable cases where people were just wrong, in ways that were enormously consequential. Like, for example, the Great Depression. Is like, I think most people don't really understand this. They think it was inevitable, but it wasn't. That's the big conclusion that economists have about the Great Depression, is that it wasn't inevitable. That people in power had a set of economic theories and they said we should do this, and they pursued it, and it led us into this catastrophe. And I think we're at a point where we can look at our world and say something similar might have happened 30 years ago, when we made choices about how to set up the international trade system that had profound consequences, and they were not the only choices we could have made.
Yeah.
And I think we're at a time where maybe we can start to make some different choices that can enable both the prosperity, the security that comes from having a national industrial base, while also the prosperity that comes from international trade, and on a fundamental level from the democratic control over your own economy. Um, so thank you, Steve, so much. This has been a really great conversation, about the world we live in and how we got here and where we might be going. So yeah, thank you so much for coming on Neoliberalism.
Well, thank you so much for having me. As I say, I'm a big fan. I love your essays, so I'm really delighted to have met you in this way. And this was a really enjoyable conversation. So thanks so much.
All right, cheers.
Bye bye.